On March 14, 1888, the Hancock County Register published a brief notice about 3 sisters arriving in Riverside Bend, Iowa. The newspaper described them as respectable widows seeking honest employment in the quiet farming community. But the Register's editor had no idea what he was really documenting. The beginning of a scandal so explosive that within 6 months, nearly every married man in town would be trapped in a web of secrets, lies, and dependencies that threatened to tear the entire community apart. Before we dive into the story, if you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of American history, where respectability and secrecy collided in ways that still echo today, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious about our audience. Drop your location and local time below. Now let's continue with the story. The spring of 1888 arrived in Riverside Bend, with farmers preparing fields and merchants restocking shelves. The First Presbyterian Church held its Easter services with the town's most prominent families, filling the front pews, dressed in their finest clothes, projecting an image of moral certainty that defined small-town Iowa. Into this world of predictable rhythms came the Wellesley sisters. Census records from that year list them as Constance, age 32, Beatrice, age 29, and Louisa, age 26. The documents describe them as widows from Pennsylvania, each claiming their husbands had died in industrial accidents back east. They rented a modest 2-story house on Sycamore Street at the very edge of town, where farmland began its sprawl toward the horizon. The house itself became a subject of immediate interest. According to property records preserved in the county archives, they paid 6 months' rent in advance, an unusual practice that suggested either careful planning or substantial resources. The landlord, a retired farmer named Otto Lindgren, later told the Riverside Gazette that the women seemed refined and educated, speaking with Eastern accents and carrying themselves with uncommon dignity. Constance, the eldest, presented herself to Reverend Nathaniel Finch within days of their arrival. Church registry documents show she requested membership, attended services faithfully, and volunteered to help with charitable works. Beatrice found employment briefly at the Gunderson General Store, where her pleasant manner and quick mind with figures impressed the owner's wife, Martha. Louisa offered music lessons, advertising in the local paper that she'd studied piano in Philadelphia. Within 3 weeks, church ladies visited for tea, returning with favorable reports about the sisters' tasteful furnishings and proper comportment. The Methodist minister's wife, Eleanor Pritchard, wrote in her private diary that the Wellesley sisters seemed a touch melancholy, as befits their widowed state, but possessed of gracious manners and genuine Christian charity. What these respectable women didn't notice were the evening visitors, men arriving after dark, entering through the back door, staying for an hour or 2 before departing separately into the night. The pattern began slowly in April, just isolated incidents that might have been explained as business consultations or friendly calls. By May, the frequency had increased. Harold Gunderson, owner of the general store and husband to Martha, made regular Tuesday visits. Thomas Svensson, whose wife taught at the schoolhouse, appeared every Thursday. Even Otto Lindgren, the elderly landlord, found reasons to stop by on Saturday afternoons. The sisters had arrived in Riverside Bend, and within weeks, they had begun constructing something the town had never seen before. By June of 1888, something unprecedented had taken root in Riverside Bend. The Wellesley sisters' house on Sycamore Street had become a destination for nearly every man of influence in town, yet the operation remained invisible to casual observation. Bank records from the Riverside Savings and Trust tell part of the story. Between April and July, deposit slips show the sisters had accumulated nearly $800, a staggering sum, equivalent to what a successful farmer might earn in 2 years. The deposits came in odd amounts, $12 here, $18 there, sometimes as much as $40, suggesting multiple sources rather than regular employment. More revealing were the withdrawal patterns. Property deeds filed at the county courthouse show Constance Wellesley loaning money to Samuel Briggs for expanding his lumber mill. Business partnership documents reveal Beatrice as a silent investor in the new grain elevator being constructed on the railway siding. Even the town's most respectable enterprises had become entangled with the sisters' growing financial web. But money told only part of the story. According to surviving correspondence discovered in the Iowa Historical Society archives, the sisters offered something far more valuable than physical intimacy. They provided a space where men could speak freely, without the moral judgments and social constraints that governed every other interaction in their lives. Jacob Henriksen, a farmer struggling with crop failures, found Constance willing to discuss his fears about losing his land without demanding he maintain the facade of masculine confidence. The bank president, Arthur Whitfield, confessed to Beatrice his doubts about a risky investment, receiving practical business advice that later saved him from bankruptcy. Young Timothy Walsh, barely 23 and newly married, admitted to Louisa his terror about becoming a father, finding sympathy instead of the stoic silence expected of men. The sisters had identified a profound gap in the social architecture of Riverside Bend. Victorian morality demanded that men present themselves as confident, decisive, and emotionally impenetrable. Their wives, raised to be moral guardians and domestic managers, could not be partners in vulnerability. The church offered confession, but only within rigid theological frameworks. Friendships between men remained superficial, governed by competition and social hierarchy. Into this emotional desert, the Wellesley sisters built an oasis. Letters preserved in private collections reveal that men began visiting, not just for companionship or desire, but for conversation. They discussed business troubles, family conflicts, political ambitions, and personal doubts. The sisters listened, advised, and kept absolute confidence. In return, they received payment, information, and growing influence over the town's affairs. Each sister specialized according to her strengths. Constance handled financial consultations, charging for expertise that proved consistently valuable. Beatrice mastered social engineering, understanding family alliances, old grudges, and political factions. Men seeking elected office or business partnerships consulted her about strategy. She knew which families held influence, which debts created obligations, which marriages were strong, and which were merely for appearance. Louisa, the youngest and most empathetic, became a confidant for emotional matters. She charged the least, but created the deepest dependencies. Men who initially came for her physical beauty found themselves returning to talk, to be heard without judgment, to experience a form of intimacy their marriages could not provide within the rigid gender roles of the era. By late summer, the sisters had achieved something extraordinary. They had made themselves essential to the functioning of Riverside Bend's male power structure while remaining officially invisible. Wives saw their husbands leaving on business, attending town meetings, or checking on investments. The explanations were plausible enough because many of them were partially true. What made the system nearly unbreakable was its interconnectedness. The lumber mill owner couldn't expose the sisters without revealing his financial dependence. The bank president couldn't act without admitting he'd shared confidential client information. The town council members couldn't prosecute without explaining why they'd been meeting secretly with unmarried women for months. The sisters hadn't just created a business. They'd built a shadow government, powered not by force or official authority, but by accumulated secrets, financial entanglements, and the desperate human need to be understood. And by August, when the first wife began to suspect the true nature of what was happening, unraveling it would prove nearly impossible. Martha Gunderson found the letter on August 23, 1888, while searching her husband's desk for the household accounts. It was tucked inside a ledger, written in feminine script on expensive stationery that bore no return address. H, it began, using only her husband's initial. Your consultation fee for July has been received. Regarding the matter we discussed concerning the Davenport supplier, I have confirmed your suspicions through my own channels. The man is overextended and will likely default before winter. I suggest alternative arrangements. Thursday at 8, as usual. C. Martha's hands trembled as she read it twice, then 3 times. Her husband Harold had been making Thursday visits to check inventory at the warehouse for months. She'd accepted the explanation because Harold had always been devoted to their business, often working late into the evening. But this letter suggested something else entirely. Her private journal, donated to the Iowa Historical Society by her granddaughter in 1962, provides a detailed account of what happened next. Martha did not immediately confront her husband. Instead, she waited until the following Thursday, then followed him through the darkening streets of Riverside Bend. Harold walked past the warehouse entirely. He continued down Main Street, turned onto Sycamore, and approached the house where the Wellesley sisters lived. Martha watched from behind an elm tree as her husband knocked on the back door. It opened almost immediately, and Constance Wellesley admitted him with a familiar gesture that suggested this was indeed routine. Martha stood frozen in the late summer heat, her mind racing through possibilities. An affair seemed obvious, yet the letter had mentioned business, suppliers, consultation fees. The clinical language didn't match the passionate betrayal she'd imagined. She waited 40 minutes, watching other men arrive and depart through that same back entrance. She recognized Thomas Svensson, the schoolteacher's husband, then young Timothy Walsh, then 2 farmers whose names she couldn't recall in her shock. When Harold finally emerged, looking relaxed and carrying what appeared to be documents, Martha intercepted him on the street. According to her journal, their confrontation was brief and devastating. Harold, caught completely off guard, tried to deny everything until Martha recited the letter's contents verbatim. Then his resistance collapsed. What he told her that night, standing under the street lamp on Sycamore Street, was somehow worse than simple infidelity. He admitted visiting the sisters regularly since May. He confessed to paying Constance for business advice, acknowledging she had better financial instincts than he did. He had shared confidential information about suppliers, competitors, and customers. The advice had been valuable, he insisted. The store's profits had increased 30% since he had started consulting with her. Martha's journal entry from that night reveals her complex reaction. She felt betrayed, certainly, but also confused. Harold insisted he'd never been physically intimate with any of the sisters. His visits were purely consultative, he claimed. Though he admitted other men likely had different arrangements, he'd paid money, yes, but received value in return. He'd kept it secret because he knew how it would look, how it would sound. But why them? Martha had demanded. Why not discuss business with me? I work in that store every day. Harold's response, preserved in her meticulous handwriting, was brutally honest. Because you would tell me what I should do, what was proper, what was moral. Constance tells me what will work. She doesn't judge. She just thinks. Over the following week, Martha made a discovery that transformed her understanding of the situation. In carefully worded conversations with other wives, avoiding direct accusations, she learned she wasn't alone in her suspicions. Sarah Walsh had noticed her husband's Tuesday absences. Elizabeth Briggs had found unexplained withdrawals in their bank account. Caroline Henriksen had intercepted a cryptic note similar to Martha's. The women began meeting privately, comparing observations, and piecing together the scope of what was happening. What emerged was far larger than any of them had imagined. The Wellesley sisters weren't simply running an affair, or even a brothel. They'd constructed an elaborate system that had captured nearly every prominent man in Riverside Bend. The question was what to do about it. Exposing the arrangement would humiliate their husbands, destroy their families' reputations, and potentially collapse businesses throughout town. But allowing it to continue meant accepting a shadow world operating parallel to their marriages, built on secrets and payments to 3 women who'd arrived just months earlier. Martha Gunderson made a decision that would change everything. She would not confront the sisters or alert the authorities. Instead, she would investigate. And she would not do it alone. The investigation began in Margaret Svensson's parlor on September 3, 1888. 6 women gathered under the pretense of planning the church harvest festival, but their real purpose was far more urgent. Martha Gunderson had assembled allies, each one married to a man they suspected of involvement with the Wellesley sisters. Margaret Svensson, the schoolteacher, brought methodical intelligence to the group. Eleanor Finch, the pastor's wife, provided moral authority and access to church records. Sarah Walsh contributed youthful determination. Elizabeth Briggs and Caroline Henriksen added their own discoveries. Together, they represented the respectable core of Riverside Bend society, and they were about to conduct an investigation their husbands would never see coming. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity. They would not spy or accuse. Instead, they would observe, document, and most importantly, talk to women outside their immediate social circle. The wives of prominent men had maintained a careful silence about their suspicions. But what about the shopkeepers' wives, the farmers' daughters, the seamstresses and domestic workers who saw everything but were rarely asked? Within 2 weeks, a disturbing picture emerged. According to correspondence preserved in Margaret's personal papers, the sisters' influence extended far beyond the Thursday consultations and Tuesday visits. They'd become invisible partners in nearly every significant business venture in town. A new general store opening on the east side had Beatrice's financial backing. The expansion of the railway depot involved loans arranged through Constance. Even the church building fund had received a substantial anonymous donation that Eleanor traced back to the sisters. But the most unsettling discovery came from interviewing the women who worked for the Wellesley sisters. A young Irish maid named Bridget O'Connor, hired to clean the house twice weekly, provided crucial details. She'd seen the ledgers, though she couldn't read all the entries. She'd observed the careful scheduling, with different men arriving on different days at staggered times. She had noticed how the sisters maintained separate spaces within the house for different types of meetings. Bridget described 3 distinct parlors. One, furnished like a business office, where Constance met with men over documents and account books. Another decorated as a salon, where Beatrice hosted what appeared to be strategic planning sessions, sometimes with 3 or 4 men present simultaneously. The third, Louisa's domain, was more intimate, with comfortable chairs, soft lighting, and a piano where she'd play, while men talked for hours about matters Bridget couldn't hear. The investigation revealed something the wives hadn't anticipated. Many men weren't visiting for physical affairs at all. Thomas Svensson, Margaret's husband, had been meeting with Beatrice to discuss his political ambitions. He wanted to run for county supervisor, but lacked the connections and strategy. Beatrice provided both for a fee. Jacob Henriksen consulted Constance about saving his failing farm, receiving financial advice that had indeed prevented foreclosure. Timothy Walsh visited Louisa to discuss his fears about fatherhood, finding an empathy his young wife Sarah couldn't yet provide. The complexity of the arrangement troubled the investigating wives far more than simple adultery would have. If the sisters were merely prostitutes, the moral response was clear. But they'd created something that didn't fit existing categories. They were business consultants, political advisors, financial planners, and emotional confidants, all operating outside the boundaries of respectable society, yet serving functions that society desperately needed. Eleanor Finch's diary from October reveals the group's growing dilemma. "We set out to expose wickedness," she wrote, "but have instead discovered our own inadequacy. These women provide what we cannot or will not. They listen without judgment. They advise without moralizing. They understand business and politics in ways we were never taught. Our husbands come to them not just for sin, but for competence." The investigation also uncovered the economic reality binding everything together. The sisters held mortgages on 4 properties. They'd extended personal loans to at least 9 families. They possessed detailed knowledge of business dealings, family secrets, and political arrangements throughout Riverside Bend. Exposing them now would trigger financial chaos as men scrambled to cover their entanglements. By late October, Martha's group faced an impossible choice. They'd proven the scope of the sisters' operation, documented the web of dependencies, and confirmed their worst suspicions. But they'd also discovered that destroying the arrangement might destroy their own families and the town's economy. Then Margaret made a proposal that changed everything. Instead of exposure or acceptance, she suggested confrontation, not with their husbands, but with the Wellesley sisters themselves, woman to woman, without the men present, to understand exactly what they'd built and why. The meeting was arranged for November 7th. It would be unlike anything Riverside Bend had ever witnessed. Before the confrontation could occur, Martha Gunderson made one final discovery that revealed the true magnitude of what the sisters had accomplished. On November 3rd, while her husband attended a supposed town council meeting, she visited the Riverside Savings and Trust with a fabricated question about their store account. What she learned from a sympathetic bank clerk named Dorothy Pierce changed everything. The sisters weren't merely lending money. They'd become the invisible financial backbone of Riverside Bend. Dorothy, who'd watched the transactions with growing concern, showed Martha records that should have remained confidential. Between May and October of 1888, the Wellesley sisters had deposited over $2,000 and extended credit totaling nearly $4,000 more. The numbers were staggering, but the pattern was more revealing. Constance had financed the lumber mill expansion when the bank refused Samuel Briggs additional credit. She'd loaned seed money to 3 farmers after a harsh spring destroyed their crops. She'd even covered a shortfall in the school budget when county funds were delayed. In each case, her interest rates were lower than the bank's, her terms more flexible, and her willingness to take risks far greater than any legitimate financial institution. But Dorothy revealed something even more disturbing. The sisters had access to information they shouldn't possess. Constance knew about pending business deals before they were publicly announced. Beatrice understood the financial vulnerabilities of nearly every family in town. They'd built this knowledge through their network of consulting relationships, with each man inadvertently providing intelligence that strengthened the sisters' overall position. Martha obtained copies of several loan agreements, hidden inside a hymnal she'd brought to maintain appearances. The contracts were professionally drafted, legally binding, and ruthlessly advantageous. The sisters held liens on property, shares in businesses, and in some cases, claims on future profits. If every loan was called simultaneously, half the commerce in Riverside Bend would cease to function. The realization hit Martha with physical force. The sisters hadn't just identified vulnerable men and exploited them. They'd systematically made themselves indispensable to the town's economic survival. Removing them now would be like extracting a foundation stone from a building already standing. She brought this information to the November 7th meeting, but the venue had changed. The sisters, somehow learning of the wives' investigation, had sent an invitation instead. They requested the women come to Sycamore Street at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The formality of the invitation carried an unmistakable message. The sisters were not afraid. All 6 wives arrived together, presenting a united front. Constance Wellesley greeted them at the front door, not the back entrance their husbands used. She led them to the formal parlor, elegantly furnished, but notably lacking the personal touches of a real home. Beatrice and Louisa waited inside, dressed as properly as any society women, their demeanor calm and prepared. "We've been expecting this conversation," Constance began without preamble. "And we welcome it. You deserve to understand what we've built here, and why." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary exchange in Riverside Bend's history, reconstructed from Margaret Svensson's detailed notes taken immediately afterward. Constance laid out their entire operation with clinical precision. She explained how they'd identified Riverside Bend specifically because of its isolation, its prosperity, and its rigid social structure that created desperate needs with no legitimate outlets. "Your husbands come to us because they cannot come to you," Constance said. "Not because you lack intelligence or capability, but because society has constructed your marriages as prisons for both parties. Men must be stoic, decisive, and emotionally impenetrable. Women must be moral guardians, domestic managers, and repositories of virtue. Neither role permits honest partnership." Beatrice continued the explanation. "We provide what your marriages cannot, not because of personal failings, but because of structural impossibilities. A man cannot confess doubt to a wife he must appear strong before. He cannot discuss business strategy with a woman denied education and commerce. He cannot explore political ambition with a partner excluded from public life." Louisa added the final element. "And he cannot simply talk about fears and hopes and uncertainties with someone who won't judge him weak. We charge money not because we're greedy, but because payment creates professional distance. It allows honesty without the complications of affection or obligation." Eleanor Finch, the pastor's wife, responded with controlled fury. "You've manipulated vulnerable men and undermined marriages throughout this community. You've built wealth on deception and sin." "We've built wealth on providing services your society refuses to legitimize," Constance corrected. "Your husbands are not victims. They're customers making rational choices. And the web you speak of destroying? It employs people, feeds families, and keeps this town functioning. We're not the disease. We're the symptom of something much deeper." The meeting ended without resolution, but with a new understanding. The wives had expected to find predators. Instead, they'd encountered entrepreneurs who'd weaponized the contradictions of Victorian society itself. Martha Gunderson made the decision 3 days after the meeting with the sisters. If Riverside Bend's moral hypocrisy was going to be exposed, it would happen publicly, completely, and on her terms. On November 15, 1888, she requested an emergency community meeting at the First Presbyterian Church. The announcement alone created panic. According to newspaper accounts from the Riverside Gazette, nearly 200 people packed into the church that evening, filling every pew and lining the walls. The men came because their wives insisted. The wives came because they'd been quietly sharing information for weeks. Everyone suspected something momentous was about to unfold. Martha stood at the front of the church, flanked by Margaret Svensson and Eleanor Finch. She held a leather folder containing loan documents, correspondence, and bank records. When Reverend Finch called for silence, Martha began speaking with a steadiness that belied her terror. She laid out everything: the sisters' arrival, the pattern of visits, the consultation fees, the financial entanglements, the scope of the operation. She named no individual men, but her descriptions were specific enough that wives throughout the congregation turned to look at their husbands. Some men went pale. Others stared at the floor. A few looked defiant. But Martha didn't stop with accusations. She presented the economic reality. She explained how the sisters held mortgages, business partnerships, and knowledge that could destroy families. She detailed Constance's investments in local enterprises, Beatrice's role in political strategy, Louisa's function as confidant. She forced the community to see the full complexity of what had been built. "This is not a simple sin we can confess and absolve," Martha declared. "This is a structure we've collectively created through our failures to be honest with each other." The meeting exploded into chaos. Men shouted denials. Women demanded explanations. Reverend Finch called for order repeatedly, his voice lost in the tumult. Then Harold Gunderson stood up, silencing the crowd through sheer surprise. "Martha speaks the truth," he said, his voice carrying through the church. "I've been meeting with Constance Wellesley since May. I've paid her for business advice. I've shared information about our suppliers, our competitors, our finances, and her counsel has been more valuable than any I've received from other men in this town." The admission opened floodgates. Thomas Svensson stood next, confirming his consultations with Beatrice about political strategy. Jacob Henriksen admitted Constance had saved his farm from foreclosure. One by one, men rose to acknowledge their involvement, though the nature and extent varied wildly. Some had only met the sisters once or twice. Others had been regular visitors for months. What emerged from the testimonies was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Some men had indeed engaged in physical affairs with the sisters, but far more had sought business advice, political connections, or simply conversation. The sisters had become repositories for ambitions and vulnerabilities that Victorian masculinity demanded men conceal. Then Sarah Walsh, Timothy's young wife, stood trembling. "I knew," she said quietly. "I knew Timothy was visiting Louisa. He told me himself 3 months ago. He was terrified of becoming a father and couldn't talk to me about it because I was already pregnant and he thought it would hurt me." Her confession created a stunned silence. If she knew, who else had known? Eleanor Finch rose next, her position as the pastor's wife lending weight to her words. "I suspected my husband's late meetings were not all church business," she admitted. "I found correspondence from Beatrice Wellesley discussing strategy for the new parish building. I said nothing because the advice was sound and the building fund was growing." More women stood. Caroline Henriksen had known about her husband's financial consultations. Elizabeth Briggs, had discovered loan documents months earlier. At least a dozen wives throughout the church acknowledged they'd suspected or known about their husbands' connections to the sisters, and had remained silent for various reasons: fear of scandal, recognition of financial benefit, or simple uncertainty about how to address something that didn't fit conventional categories of sin. The community meeting had been intended to expose wrongdoing, but instead, it revealed something far more disturbing. Riverside Bend had been complicit in the sisters' operation. The arrangement had persisted not just through male deception, but through collective silence, willful ignorance, and tacit acceptance of benefits that came from the very system they publicly condemned. As the meeting finally adjourned near midnight, the question remained unanswered. What does a community do when it discovers its moral failure is not individual, but systemic, not hidden, but partially acknowledged, not imposed from outside, but grown from its own contradictions? The legal authorities would now have to answer that question, whether they wanted to or not. County Prosecutor Daniel Ashworth received the formal complaint on November 17, 1888. It came not from the wives or the church, but from a businessman named Frederick Dalton, who'd refused the sisters' services and now saw an opportunity to eliminate commercial rivals entangled with them. The complaint alleged that the Wellesley sisters were operating a house of prostitution in violation of Iowa morality statutes. Ashworth's private correspondence, preserved in the state archives, reveals his immediate recognition of the impossible situation. To prosecute the sisters, he would need testimony from the men who'd visited them. Those men included the mayor, 3 town council members, the bank president, half the business owners in Riverside Bend, and, crucially, 2 county judges, who would normally hear such cases. On November 21st, Ashworth met privately with Sheriff Robert Callahan to discuss their options. Callahan's official report from that meeting, filed with the county clerk, is remarkably candid. The prosecutor and I agree that a conventional prosecution is impossible. Nearly every man of standing in Riverside Bend has some connection to these women. A trial would require them to testify publicly about the nature and extent of their involvement. The resulting scandal would destroy families and collapse businesses. But the legal problem went deeper. The sisters had been careful in their arrangements. Constance's business consultations could be defended as legitimate financial advising. Beatrice's political strategy sessions resembled campaign planning. Even Louisa's emotional counseling might be characterized as a private service between consenting adults. Proving prostitution would require explicit testimony about sexual acts, and obtaining such testimony would mean threatening prominent men with perjury charges if they lied under oath. Ashworth's preliminary investigation failed. Bridget could only confirm men visited. Bank records proved nothing criminal. And most wives refused statements, recognizing public humiliation would follow. The prosecutor's December 3rd letter to the state attorney general reveals his desperation. I am confronted with clear evidence of immoral activity, yet every avenue of prosecution leads to the destruction of innocent parties. The women in question have positioned themselves such that attacking them means attacking the economic foundation of an entire community. The state attorney general's response was bureaucratically cold. Iowa law was clear about prostitution and houses of ill repute. If Ashworth had evidence, he must prosecute. If he lacked evidence sufficient for prosecution, he should drop the matter. The political implications were Ashworth's problem, not the state's. Then the situation deteriorated further. In mid-December, Constance Wellesley requested a meeting with Ashworth at his office. She arrived with documents that changed everything. According to Ashworth's notes from that meeting, Constance presented detailed records of every transaction every consultation, every loan. She'd documented everything meticulously, including signed receipts from clients acknowledging the nature of services received. "You'll notice," Constance said, "that the majority of these agreements specify business consulting, financial planning, or personal counseling. All legal services. Any prosecution claiming prostitution would require proving that these documented transactions were fraudulent, which means calling dozens of men to testify that they lied when they signed these receipts." She also revealed something Ashworth hadn't known. The sisters had been paying taxes on their income through a business entity registered in Des Moines. They'd characterized themselves as financial consultants and personal advisors. The state had accepted their tax payments without question for 6 months. "If you prosecute us for prostitution," Constance continued, "you're claiming that all these business arrangements were actually criminal enterprises. That means every man who paid us was soliciting prostitution. That makes them criminals too. Are you prepared to arrest the mayor, the bank president, and half the town council?" Ashworth recognized a legal trap when he saw one. The sisters had constructed a defense that made prosecution almost impossible without causing exactly the widespread destruction everyone feared. But Constance wasn't finished. She placed one more document on his desk, a property deed showing the sisters had purchased their rental house from Otto Lindgren 2 months earlier. "We own property in Hancock County now," she said. "That makes us residents with legal standing. If you charge us with operating a brothel, we'll defend ourselves publicly in court with full testimony about every man who ever visited us and exactly what services they purchased. We have the records, we have the receipts, and we have nothing to lose." Ashworth sat in silence after she left, recognizing that he'd been outmaneuvered completely. The sisters hadn't just built an economic web. They'd constructed a legal fortress that made them virtually untouchable. Despite Prosecutor Ashworth's reservations, public pressure forced his hand. On December 20th, 1888, formal charges were filed against the Wellesley sisters for operating a disorderly house. The trial was scheduled for January 14th, 1889, giving both sides less than a month to prepare. What happened next became one of the most remarkable legal proceedings in Iowa history. The sisters hired no attorney. Instead, Constance announced she would defend all 3 of them personally. Iowa law permitted self-representation, and the judge, Arthur Pemberton, reluctantly allowed it, despite knowing the spectacle it would create. The courtroom was packed on opening day. Newspaper reporters came from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. Every seat was filled with Riverside Bend residents eager to witness the confrontation. The all-male jury consisted of farmers from outside town, carefully selected to have no business connections to the sisters or their clients. Ashworth's prosecution was methodical but weak. He called Bridget O'Connor to testify about men visiting the house at odd hours. He presented bank records showing large cash deposits. He introduced testimony from Frederick Dalton about the sisters' reputation. But he conspicuously avoided calling any of the men who'd actually visited the house, knowing their testimony could backfire spectacularly. When Constance rose to cross-examine witnesses, the courtroom fell silent. Court transcripts preserved in the county archives show her questioning was surgical in its precision. She asked Bridget if she'd ever witnessed any illegal activity. The maid admitted she had not. Constance asked if the house was kept clean and orderly. Bridget confirmed it was immaculate. Had she ever seen violence, drunkenness, or public disturbance? Never. When Ashworth rested his case, Constance stood to present the defense. What followed was not a legal argument, but a philosophical indictment of the entire social system that had put them on trial. "Gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you've heard testimony about men visiting our home. This is true. You've heard about money changing hands. Also true. What you have not heard is any evidence of prostitution, because no such evidence exists. What we operated was a consulting business, addressing needs that society creates but refuses to acknowledge. She laid out her argument with devastating clarity. Victorian society constructed marriages as economic and social contracts, not partnerships of equals. Men were denied emotional expression, forbidden from showing weakness or doubt. Women were excluded from business, politics, and public life. The system created desperate needs on both sides, with no legitimate outlet. We provided business consulting to men whose wives were deliberately kept ignorant of commerce, Constance continued. We offered political strategy to those seeking public office in a system where such ambitions couldn't be discussed at home without appearing disloyal to family. We gave financial advice to farmers and merchants who faced ruin, but couldn't admit vulnerability to wives they were supposed to protect and provide for. Then she shifted to the prosecution's real motivation. This case isn't about prostitution. It's about power. We're being prosecuted because we succeeded at business in a world that demands women remain economically dependent. We're here because we demonstrated competence that threatens the fiction of male superiority. Every man who consulted us admitted through that action that women possess intelligence and capability equal to their own. Constance pulled out the signed receipts, reading several aloud. Each documented specific business services rendered, with no mention of anything remotely sexual. She called Harold Gunderson to the stand. He testified under oath that his consultations with Constance had been purely financial, and that her advice had increased his store's profitability. She called Thomas Svensson next. He confirmed that Beatrice's political strategy had been instrumental in his successful campaign for county supervisor. No impropriety had occurred, he swore. The relationship was professional throughout. One by one, she forced the prosecution's unnamed victims to publicly acknowledge that they'd sought out the sisters' expertise voluntarily, paid for legitimate services, and benefited from the arrangements. Each testimony undermined Ashworth's case further. Then Constance delivered her final argument. You cannot prosecute us for prostitution without admitting that every business transaction between women and men is inherently sexual. You cannot convict us without declaring that women's intelligence is itself immoral. This trial reveals the truth. Society punishes women not for what we've done wrong, but for what we've done too well. The courtroom erupted. Judge Pemberton called for order, but the damage was done. Constance had turned the prosecution into an examination of society itself, exposing hypocrisies that made conviction almost impossible without indicting the entire social order. The jury would deliberate for 3 days, wrestling with questions far more complex than simple guilt or innocence. The jury returned on January 17, 1889, with a verdict that satisfied no one. They found the sisters guilty of operating a disorderly house, but recommended minimal sentencing. Judge Pemberton imposed fines totaling $300 and issued a warning. The sisters paid immediately and walked free. But the trial had solved nothing. Riverside Bend remained divided, its moral certainties shattered, its economic dependencies unchanged. Town council meetings throughout late January devolved into shouting matches. Some demanded the sisters be expelled from the county. Others argued that destroying the arrangement would trigger financial collapse. Private correspondence from this period reveals the impossible calculus facing the community. Samuel Briggs owed Constance $1,200 for the lumber mill expansion. Calling that loan would force him into bankruptcy, eliminating 30 jobs. Jacob Henrikson's farm survived only because of Constance's restructured debt. Thomas Svensson's political career depended on connections Beatrice had facilitated. The wives found themselves in an equally complex position. Martha Gunderson's store remained profitable, largely due to advice from Constance. Margaret Svensson's husband had won his supervisory position through Beatrice's strategy. The benefits that flowed from the sisters' operation had improved their own lives, even as the arrangement undermined their marriages. On February 9th, a closed-door meeting occurred at the county courthouse. No official record exists, but letters written afterward by participants reveal what transpired. Town leaders, including Mayor Vincent Harlow, Sheriff Callahan, Prosecutor Ashworth, and representatives from the wives' group met with the Wellesley sisters to negotiate a solution. The sisters presented their terms. They would leave Riverside Bend voluntarily and relinquish all business interests in the county. In exchange, they required payment totaling $5,000, distributed among outstanding loans and consulting fees. Additionally, every man who'd conducted business with them would sign statements acknowledging legitimate professional services, protecting the sisters from future prosecution or civil suits. The price was steep, but the alternative was worse. If the sisters remained, the conflict would continue indefinitely. If they were forcibly expelled without settlement, they could call in loans simultaneously, devastating the local economy. Worse, they could publicize detailed records of every transaction, destroying reputations across Iowa. Town leaders agreed to the terms. A collection was quietly organized, with families contributing based on their level of involvement. Some paid willingly, relieved to resolve the situation. Others paid under pressure, recognizing they had no choice. By late February, the full amount had been raised. On March 2, 1889, the Wellesley sisters departed Riverside Bend on the morning train. They carried trunks of possessions, bank drafts totaling $5,000, and signed agreements protecting them from further legal action. Constance left a final letter with Martha Gunderson, later donated to the Historical Society. "We came to your town because we saw opportunity in its contradictions," the letter read. "We leave because you've chosen comfortable hypocrisy over uncomfortable truth. Your marriages will remain as they were, your businesses will continue, and in 5 years, most of you will have convinced yourselves we never existed. But you'll know, in private moments, that everything we revealed about your society was true." The sisters were gone, but the questions they'd raised would haunt Riverside Bend for generations. By spring of 1889, Riverside Bend attempted to return to normal. The Wellesley sisters' house stood empty for months before being purchased by a family from Chicago who knew nothing of its history. The town's newspapers stopped mentioning the incident entirely. In public, the matter was closed. But census records from 1890 tell a different story. 3 couples had divorced, an unprecedented number for rural Iowa. Harold and Martha Gunderson separated that summer, with Martha taking over full management of the store. Thomas and Margaret Svensson remained married, but Margaret began teaching business courses to women at the schoolhouse, an unusual development that drew criticism from conservative residents. Several prominent men simply vanished from town. Records. Samuel Briggs sold his lumber mill and moved to Nebraska. Timothy Walsh relocated his family to Minnesota, reportedly seeking a fresh start away from the scandal. The departures left gaps in Riverside Bend's social fabric that took years to fill. More surprising were the women who changed. Eleanor Finch, the pastor's wife, began advocating publicly for women's education in financial matters. Sarah Walsh, before leaving town, wrote letters to the Riverside Gazette, arguing that wives should be full partners in family business decisions. The sisters' brief presence had planted ideas that wouldn't easily disappear. The incident became a carefully guarded secret. Town histories published in the early 1900s made no mention of the Wellesley sisters. Families who'd been involved refused to discuss it with their children. The conspiracy of silence was nearly perfect. Nearly, but not entirely. In 1963, a local historian named Patricia Thornton was researching her doctoral dissertation on economic development in rural Iowa. While examining county courthouse records, she discovered the trial transcripts from January 1889. Intrigued by the cryptic charges and the unusual self-defense, she began investigating deeper. Thornton spent 2 years tracking down surviving letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts. She interviewed descendants of the families involved, many of whom were shocked to learn their grandparents' secrets. Her dissertation, published in 1965, finally revealed the full story to the academic community. What happened to the Wellesley sisters remained mysterious. Thornton found a single newspaper mention from 1892, reporting that a Constance Wellesley had opened a business consulting firm in San Francisco. Whether this was the same woman, and whether her sisters joined her, couldn't be confirmed. Riverside Bend itself survived, eventually thriving through the 20th century. But those who studied its history closely could see the scars. The divorce rates remained higher than surrounding counties. Women's education initiatives flourished earlier there than in comparable towns. Something fundamental had shifted. The story of the Wellesley sisters reveals uncomfortable truths about Victorian America. It shows how rigid gender roles created markets for services society refused to legitimize. It demonstrates how moral certainty collapses when confronted with human complexity. Most importantly, it proves that even in the most controlled communities, people will find ways to meet needs their society denies. Riverside Bend tried to forget, but some truths, once exposed, can never be completely buried. If this glimpse into hidden American history has moved you, if these forgotten voices deserve to be heard and remembered, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. These stories exist in archives and forgotten documents across the country, waiting to teach us about the contradictions we've inherited and the courage it takes to confront them. Help us bring more of these buried truths to light.